I'm glad to see so many people from so many places. Congratulations to the Portuguese. Welcome to the Californians. Greetings to ex-students, colleagues, friends from all over. So my name is James Cowling. I will be talking about privileged access management today. I will do my best to handle questions kind of as we go along. There's a questions window in your client which you can ask questions. Don't worry if I don't answer them kind of in line. I should get to them in due course. I should be speaking for around about 40 minutes, and then we should have about 5 minutes for questions at the end. This session will be recorded, so just bear that in mind if you say anything. We will be recording this for future generations. I will also be asking you a few questions, not very many, but some questions. Clearly, due to the nature of the conversation, the answers to those questions can be somewhat sensitive. I'm going to ask you if you've ever had your privileged credentials hacked, for example. Bear in mind, I can tell who says what. I know who answered what to which question, so I tell you that in advance, so you don't feel forced to answer if you feel that it's oversensitive. But if you do answer, I will know who said what, so just so that you know. All right. So ask questions as you go along or at the end, and we'll try and deal with it as we go along. So we're going to talk a little bit about privileged access in general, and what this PAM thing, this privileged access management from Microsoft, what that solves. This is an important point, of course. What are we trying to do? Then we look at a little bit about how we go about it. How does the Microsoft solution solve the problem? And no conversation really is complete without addressing a similar problem in the cloud. So there are just a few slides about what we can do in the cloud. It's not specifically about the PAM product, but it's part of our general approach. So before we can really talk about the solution, we need to know what we mean by privileged access and what the problem is. Whenever you look at an environment, you come across really two categories of privileged access. Privileged access, by definition, is something which could allow a group membership or some sort of privilege that could allow me to make somebody else privileged. If I have that permission, then I have a privileged permission. That's kind of a clear definition of a privileged access. But also any account or privilege that might be destructive, so denial of access. Even if I can't make somebody else privileged, maybe I can stop the whole system working in some way. So clearly any permission which would interrupt our continuity of business, we ought to be elevating that to a privileged level. So those are kind of the general attitudes about privileged access, and those are kind of absolute rules that you simply apply. The implementation specific point I'm making here is slightly more subjective. Clearly, there are in many businesses large repositories of data, whether they're databases or document stores or critical systems in some way. And clearly, anybody who can do damage or even read data from those systems might be seen as privileged. They might do significant damage to our business if that credential became widely available. And so even if they don't fall into the two general categories above, any implementation specific permissions where the business would be damaged by their compromise, clearly we have to consider those to be privileged as well. So that's part of a slightly more organization specific discussion where we consider what we're talking about. What are the privileged accesses that we are talking about in this particular environment we're dealing with? The last point there talks about compliance. Clearly, we may have risks to the business from fines or other penalties due to government agencies who would be unimpressed if we were compromised. Whether or not it's actually significant to our other stakeholders, we don't want to be fined by the government, so we need to consider our compliance requirements as well, of course. So the specific problem that we're dealing with here is the theft of privileged account credentials. There are many products on the market which consider privileged access management or privileged identity management, and they address a variety of issues. The specific issue we're dealing with here is the theft of Kerberos credentials from an Active Directory system. This is primarily the point of what we're doing. So we're trying to avoid the situation in which an attacker, and they will usually be attacking us using a mixture of initially social engineering, and then some sort of APT, an advanced persistent threat, some form of malware that they will attempt to install on some workstation in our environment, and it will sit there and both attempt to steal credentials from the local workstation and also install itself on further workstations to steal credentials from those. So we're talking about, usually, in this particular case, cached Windows credentials which can be stolen and misused by an attacker. It's a very specific threat profile that we're dealing with. So if someone does manage to steal a privileged credential, I'll talk a bit more about the attack profile in a minute, but if someone does, of course, steal that some sort of privileged credential, then they can either go right ahead and do all the things I've listed there below, so create additional accounts and install things and destroy our data, or even before they get to that level of privilege, they may have sufficient privileges to move to another system where they might find more privileged credentials. So any level of privilege where they can move from system to system is dangerous to us, particularly if any of those privileges contain a local administrator permission, which allows them to read the credential cache on that Windows workstation. So what can happen then? A theft of a privileged account can lead to what we call escalation of that privilege. In other words, they can go on to steal more account credentials which are increasingly privileged. And with those increasing privileges, they can move towards this environment where they can create accounts, they can delete logs, they can modify settings so that we are relatively defenseless against them. And anybody who's been involved in a project, as I have, chasing attackers in real time out of a system, it's a particularly scary experience and not one you want to have to live through. So once they do have highly privileged permissions, in this case they were enterprise administrators, so once they'd reached that level, very, very hard to beat them out of the system. So that's the problem. What can they do? Well, clearly these are the things we're dealing with. Obviously, as IT guys, if we're IT pros, we just don't like losing IT functionality. It's a bad thing. So from a business point of view, we lose the functionality, and it can be extremely expensive to remediate. There are cases where whole IT systems have simply been trashed and rebuilt from the ground up after such an attack because there was no effective remediation except for rebuilding. The alternative, of course, is to try to beat the attackers out of the system and clean it up. All of that is extremely expensive and distracting to the IT business. Once we've got past that, of course, our brand tends to be damaged. These things we are typically going to have reporting requirements, so we may well have to make this public, and so we can lose the trust of our customers, we can damage our brand, and these other things that I've listed, I'm going to read them out for you. But of course we may lose business data, we may have very specific financial penalties as well as the costs I just mentioned, and of course for us as individuals it can be pretty career limiting to have these things happen on our watch. So none of these effects of a successful attack are particularly welcome, and all of these are good motivations and good justifications for getting involved in a project to prevent these sorts of attacks taking place. Some of the early attacks happened when we weren't really aware of these sorts of dangers, but I don't think we can really claim a lack of information anymore. I think the attack profiles are pretty well known, and we need to be taking steps to remediate. So what are we going to do? Well, clearly the best thing to do is to prevent the attacks, and this is one of the things we're talking about. So PAM, when we talk about the attack profile, we'll talk a little bit about user education to try to prevent social engineering being successful. But clearly prevention is a generally good thing. But if we can't prevent, and generally the assumption these days is that we cannot prevent attacks, we assume a security posture known as assume breach. So we will assume that we have been breached, we assume that people are currently attacking our network. It's the only safe posture to take from a security standpoint. So we assume breach, and then we spend significant effort then trying to detect attacks. There's a long discussion to be had about detecting attacks. There are various methods and tools. The general rule of thumb is that we detect the attackers when they're in motion. Once they're in place and reading our data, it's very hard to detect them. When they're in motion, when they're actually performing their attack, and when they're actually escalating and moving sideways from system to system, that's when we can see them doing it. During the early stages of an attack, And that's where things like Microsoft's ATA, Advanced Threat Analytics, can help us see network traffic which is part of reconnaissance or attack, and actually detect them in motion. And then, of course, if we are successfully attacked, then we need to respond, and there are many things we might do. I'm not going to go into details, but these are all parts of the consideration wrapped around these projects. So clearly, immediate countermeasures. If it's a Microsoft network, the advice is always to notify Microsoft's response team before you attempt to chase the attackers out of your network, because they will help you make a coordinated countermeasure. You will at some point have notification requirements, clearly at least internally, but also you may have some legal notification requirements, and you may have some requirements down at the bottom there about preserving evidence for law enforcement and for insurance and things like that. So there are a number of layers at which you have to pay attention, and you, as you can imagine, if you haven't already done this, you need to be prepared. You fundamentally need to be prepared, because these sorts of responses that I mentioned here on this list just don't get created overnight. You have to pretty much know what you're planning to do when the thing happens. So just a few points there. Again, there's plenty to talk about around that, but that's not really what we're here for. So let's move on. I did say I'd talk a bit about attack. This is a specific attack that was analyzed in detail after the event. So this is pretty much real information. And the evidence is that in this particular attack, there was an attack on a low privilege account. This was an account used by an air conditioning vendor. So it was an external account. It wasn't used very often. The vendor was not an internal employee. They just had an account for whenever they showed up on site. And that was where the initial attack took place. It was a very low privilege account, but it was not particularly well guarded. And there was a specific spear phishing social engineering attack to persuade this individual to click on a link and install therefore the malware that then started to steal credentials from that machine. And because on that machine there were some help desk credentials from somebody from the help desk had been there, those help desk credentials then had permissions to other machines. So this is what we mean when we talk about lateral movement, a little bit further down. Lateral movement, using these stolen credentials, you move to another machine, steal some more credentials, move to another machine, steal some more credentials. As far as you can, you escalate your privilege by stealing these tokens until you get to administrative level, so you effectively own the domain. So this preparation, they reckon, took about 11 months. The actual attack, from the individual clicking on the infected link through to the attackers owning the network, being admins in the network, was about a 48-hour period. So again, there's no time to respond if you're not well prepared to prevent the attack once it starts to take place. You will need to be well prepared and paying attention. And of course, all your prevention steps need to be in place. But once it then took place, the kind of the biggest scare here, I think, is the 13 months it took them to detect the attack at all, during which time data was simply being siphoned out of the company. And nobody knew about it. So in this case, actually, a federal agency notified the organization that data was flowing to suspicious targets in the internet, and the organization themselves didn't detect it. It was a federal agency that notified them of the attack. So there are plenty of scary things on this slide, and much to talk about, but I'm not going to go into it in much more detail than that. So that is the sort of thing we're trying to protect against, particularly this business of token theft, particularly where the tokens might be of very privileged accounts. The rule of thumb then is, if the tokens are simply not present on the computers concerned, they cannot be stolen. So this is our primary defense here, is just simply not to have those tokens present in the attackable network. And we'll talk about how we're going to achieve that in a minute. So specifically, what are the defenses we talk about? Two main categories: just-in-time and just-enough administration. So just-in-time administration is the concept of not being a permanent admin, or not having permanent admins. So if our administrators are, generally speaking, not administrators most of the time, when they're on vacation or when they're at home or when they currently have no administrative tasks to perform, then it's not much use if someone steals my credential, because my credential doesn't have valid permissions. Now, that is, if you know your Kerberos technicalities, there is a period of time, of course, when a Kerberos token has been issued and is valid and remains valid, even if the user isn't currently logged on, and so that period needs to be monitored quite carefully. And these are periods measured in well, sometimes hours, sometimes days, but certainly not months. So if I'm on vacation for 3 or 4 weeks, then at least for the bulk of that time, I'm not vulnerable to attack if someone did steal my account. So the point is that from an administrative standpoint, we give the administrators that we want eventually to be able to do administration, they become candidates or temporary admins, but the actual administrative groups in the real system are basically empty. And these, for example, the domain administrators group would be empty, but we would have a handful of people who have candidate status. The user then goes to our system, our PAM system, which is secure, and we'll talk about why we think it's secure, but we believe that our PAM system is going to be secure. And using that secure system, where we know it is the user and only the user making the request, they request elevation, which means I would like to make use of my candidate status to be that admin for a period of time. Considerations that we'll bring into any project would be, at that point, it's pretty much mandatory to have two-factor authentication in that environment. If we're letting our admins just log in with a password, then we're probably asking for trouble. That's a very good question, Dave. Can you use Azure MFA with on-premise PAM? The technical answer is yes. The practical answer is that it's problematic because of the need for internet access. So you may decide that the internet access renders your security a little bit dubious. So Azure MFA, because of its internet connectivity requirements, could be a challenge. So the next question is, do I need approvals? So where do I put the approval steps? Clearly we can't just let users run around and say, I'd like to be a domain admin. At some point we have to approve, you're welcome, Dave, you have to approve their step up to be a domain admin. Generally speaking, this approval will take place at the candidate stage, so you'll have an approval to say, yes, this person may become a candidate for domain admin. Under some circumstances, you may consider them to be pre-approved. We'll talk about that in a minute. But certainly when they come to elevate, when they actually come to do their domain admin work at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning, you may decide that it's not something you want to wake up the boss for, to get permission to do that. On the other hand, there are plenty of environments where there is a full-time security desk running permanently and monitoring these things permanently, at which point you could say that security desk must approve elevations every time. So you could go for that. Again, optional business and possible to implement, not difficult. So your elevated privilege is valid for a limited amount of time, usually an hour, but it's up to you to set that policy. The point being that if the credentials do get stolen at some point, these are cache credentials lying around on workstations where this user did log in at some point. The point is that if we're using just-in-time admin, they are unlikely to be elevated at any given point in time if we only let the users elevate when they absolutely have to do privileged work. Just enough admin, this is the business of minimum permissions. This has been a standard for a very long time, where we make sure that users just don't have domain admin permissions because they feel like it. They have rather more specific permissions to perform the task that they are due to perform. So lower level admin permissions or more specific permissions. And we'll do our best to perform attestation or review of those permissions on a regular basis so that we know that they're still applicable to the task. A certain Edward Snowden went around collecting permissions over time, and in his case he collected permissions for what were apparently legitimate reasons at the time, but due to the lack of strong attestation in that environment, he managed to keep them and built up a good library of permissions. So again, the point of this is to make sure, of course, that any stolen credentials don't have broad privileges across the board or domain admin type level permissions. They're rather more specific to a task. Still not going to rescue us necessarily, but we should do our best there. So these are the things that we're working on. These are the concepts that we're working towards. So let's talk a little bit, move towards the implementation. We assume breach. So we assume that our production network is vulnerable and possibly already infected. and we, practically speaking, have no effective mitigation. We cannot absolutely guarantee that there is no malware running today, no APTs present in our network today, and we can't guarantee that there will be none tomorrow. So if we can't make those guarantees, we have to assume that we either have been breached or we are going to be at some point. And therefore we know that the chain of trust, in other words, the series of steps that bring us to trust our administrators, is fundamentally unreliable. So anything that happens in our current production environment is, from a really strict security point of view, untrustworthy, because we don't know, or rather we assume, that we have been breached and there are people monitoring our network traffic or ready to steal our credentials at any time. So the only real option that exists is to establish a bastion forest. This is what's sometimes called a red network or a privileged network, where it's a separate environment, separate AD forests, usually sitting on a separate network, well firewalled. It clearly has to be connected in some way, but well firewalled from the production network, where we only host very limited functionality. This is our PAM environment. This is our privileged environment. We make ourselves safe by only inviting a small number of users, and those users are trained and sensitized to the business of security. So they know about second factor, they know about not reusing passwords, they know about not leaving themselves logged in while they're away, this sort of thing. And so we have a small population, we have no legacy protocols, so we're only running the most up-to-date and patched servers. We're not using any NTLMs or NTLM2s or simple LDAPs or anything like this. And many of you will not be surprised, but I'm regularly surprised by how many of these legacy protocols are still used in corporate environments, particularly simple LDAP authentication, plain text authentication over the network. It's a scary amount of legacy stuff still running and basically exposing credentials all the time. Whether they're privileged credentials or not remains to be seen, but at least credentials are being exposed. So we will have in this environment none of that, no legacy protocols, and we'll only allow strong authentication using the most up-to-date technology that we have, whatever that is. So whether they're smart cards or whether they're going to be smart cards, I think, in this environment. So the main thing is then we can now get our trusted users, our privileged users, to log into this environment and only into this environment, and there they can get to their admin accounts. The production services trust this, okay, and the trust looks like this. Wait till you see that. So, simple picture in this case, we've got our blue privileged bastion forest being trusted by the corporate environment. It's a one-way trust, so that the privileged accounts do have, or could be given permissions to access things in the corporate environment, but certainly not the other way around, clearly to protect ourselves against this untrustworthy corporate environment. So in this forest, and we'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, in this environment we're going to have our own Active Directory forest, a new forest created, so at least 2 domain controllers. We're going to pay attention to high availability. Clearly we do not want our privileged environment to be unavailable for any bad reason. So we need some high availability things going on here. So domain controllers there. We're going to have some MIM 2016 servers running on SQL servers. So we're going to have a SQL Server cluster for availability, and we're going to be running at a minimum the basic MIM PAM services. We'll need a MIM database, because that's where this is a service database for those of you who know your MIM, where it contains the configurations for roles and privileges that I'll talk about in a moment. It also hosts the REST APIs that allow us to do the escalation processes, and it'll install the PowerShell commandlets, which we can also use. I put sync on here because the implementations that we do typically contain a synchronization server as well. This is because of the need to perform ongoing lifecycle management with administrators coming and going, and new groups being onboarded to the privileged environment, new users being onboarded and offboarded to the privileged environment. There are things that you do want to synchronize around the place. You don't have to have the sync engine there, but we typically use it because it's there. So what's going to happen then is that the user is going to be given in the privileged environment some permissions on a just-in-time basis. So they're going to connect to the privileged environment, say I would like to be domain admin for a period of time. They're going to get that privilege, and using the trust, they're going to come back across the trust and access whatever it is they need to do in the corporate environment and do their job for a period of time. The main thing about that is they're doing it from a workstation that's connected to the privileged environment. Their credentials, their primary access token is on a privileged workstation, which we firmly believe is at least comparatively not vulnerable to these attacks. Clearly, we will need to pass a session token, a session ticket over to the corporate environment. We can talk briefly about session tickets and their lifetime in a few minutes, but that's a minimum footprint that we don't have our ticket granting ticket available in the corporate environment. We only have a session ticket available there, which is comparatively less usable for misuse. Okay, so there's our forest. That's where we're going to do our work. This is the Bastion forest, the privileged forest. We've talked about most of these things. We're going to pay a lot of attention to its limited scope, keeping it cut down to the absolute minimum functionality that we need to reduce our attack surface. We're going to have selective authentication going on. Who can access what? So these privileged accounts using a Windows policy should only be able to log in to selected workstations, whether it be at some sort of a terminal server type environment where you're hosting virtual desktops for the users, or specific hosted real workstations that they can log into. But nevertheless, these privileged accounts clearly shouldn't actually be able to log in just anywhere. In particular, they should not be able to log into the corporate environment. We don't want these credentials visible in the corporate environment. So because of the trust, in principle, they could log into a corp workstation, but we must make sure they can't and don't. Otherwise, we have just broken the entire purpose of this exercise. So availability is a big issue. Multiple domain controllers, clustered SQL servers, multiple MIM servers. And because no plan is entirely foolproof, we have these things we call break glass accounts. What happens if our priv environment explodes and burns to the ground? How do I then do administration in my corporate environment? Well, I have a break glass account. This is an account that's possibly even literally behind breakable glass, where it has never been used. It is a domain administrator, probably the enterprise administrator in this case, for the corporate environment. It's never been used, and should it ever be used, all sorts of red lights flash and alarms go off to make it clear that it has been used. So this is our emergency access back into the system in case our privileged environment does become unavailable. But clearly, we want it to remain available, and we plan strongly for that to be the case. Because we don't trust corporate environment accounts in here, it's worth having the conversation about how do we operate this environment. It's a very critical environment, not just from a security standpoint. It needs to be available. What SQL DBAs do we have who we let into this privileged environment? What AD guys are coming in here to do operational management, patching, monitoring, this sort of thing? How are we managing the operations of this environment, given that we can't just let people come in from the corporate environment and do their normal job in a normal way? We have to work out a new way of getting them in to do the operations. Okay, Dave, I'll cover that in a sec. Okay, your question? I'll get to that. We're going to talk about what it really looks like. So here's what it is. We're getting slowly towards a picture of how this actually works. So just-in-time administration, we separate our identities into forests, into separate forests. So we have a separate privileged identity. The privileged identity actually exists in the AD environment, in the priv environment. It is a priv account and only a priv account. We must impress upon our users that if they are using passwords, they're only using a different password from their corporate environment, of course. We don't want any bad behavior. In the MIM system, in the privileged environment, we have some objects. We have objects known as PAM roles. These are role objects that contain multiple privileges. The groups that we want to manage, so domain admins, for example, that would be a privilege. That's represented as a group, and that is a privilege within a particular role. I'll show you, I think I've got a picture of this coming out, which might make it a little bit clearer. When you get in, you will elevate a role. You'll say, I want to be the corporate administrator role, and you would then get group memberships in any of the privileges contained in that role. So this gives us a multiple level role management capability, which can give us some flexibility to, because escalation is something of a laborious task, you have to log into a special place and you have to go through an escalation process. You might want to say, well, okay, for that effort you get several permissions that allow you to do a particular task. Rather than having to escalate each individual group that you need, you can go for a separate role. A couple of questions. Want to be a privileged machine joined to the priv forest? Yes, you're going to have dedicated machines for privileged work. Correct. It is technically possible to install it in the corp domain. Yes. Given our assumed breach posture, not particularly advisable, I would suggest, but there you go. So in the usage then, we've said this pretty much. So we've made users available in PAM, and I'll show you how in a minute. We've got some scripts that we can use. So the user is registered in PAM as a candidate, so they have a user account in PAM which they can log into in the privileged environment, and they are entered as a candidate against a particular role. So they're going to go ahead and make a request. The UI could look like this. So I don't know what the network port is. I'm afraid, Guy, you're going to have to talk to one of our technical guys. But we've got the UI showing here. This is a sample portal which Microsoft have made available on GitHub. They're not proposing to support it and make it beautiful and you know, continue to develop it. It's there as a sample that you can pick up and use. Ultimately, all it's doing is calling a REST API behind the scenes, so you can call that any way you like, or you can simply call PowerShells that I'll list in a moment. But you can see there that down at the bottom, you can see that someone has already requested, in this case, the JIT corp admin's role. They could extend it. They've got a few more minutes left. But they only see here the roles that they are candidates for. So managing the candidate list is going to be pretty important to us. And then you can see the request history, who asked for what. You can leave comments and things like that, and you can see the current status of these requests for monitoring purposes. Okay, so how does this actually work then? Normally what's going to happen is the groups that we want to be privileged have a whole raft of permissions in the corporate network. We don't want to replace those permissions with permissions for groups out of the privileged environment. We could do, but more likely we're going to use SID history. So when we migrate a corporate group into the privileged environment, the PowerShells that we use will write the SID of the group in the corporate environment into SID history on the, if you like, the shadow group, the mirror image of that group created in the privileged environment. So that means when I get that privileged group membership, I also get the old SID of the group back in the corporate environment, and via SID history then I am able to access the resources secured by that corporate group. So Nosh, you asked, the service account used by MIM is privileged. Well, we secure that. We're talking about the privileged environment. The upcoming service pack for MIM 2016 contains the capability for the administrators of MIM also to be managed by PAM, which is useful. And it also contains the capability for the service account to use authentication policy silos within the privileged environment. So we secure it basically using authentication policies and policy silos. Okay, where were we? So yes, monitoring. Back in the corporate environment, this slide shows that a user that's not in PAM has been put in a monitored security group. So this is back in the, this particular one is being monitored in the privileged environment according to the screenshot. Oh, no, it's not. It's being monitored from the privileged environment. We're looking at a corp group. You can see there, corp forest. So what we're doing here, of course, is monitoring. We have migrated this group 2, out of the corp forest and put it into privileged management, and this person, Sharon, has been put into that group by hand in the corporate environment, thereby violating our privileged management policies, and therefore we want to know. So there is monitoring to make sure that people aren't misbehaving themselves. Okay, are the access token information stored? I am showing something, I hope, Donny. Can you see it now? I'm seeing 100%. So the access token information, the access token itself, of course, is generated when you use Kerberos, but the business of which accesses you will get when you get a role, this is in the application DB, in the service, the MIM service database. That's where we do our configuration of which permissions you get. Okay, got to move on. So here we are with the detail then. So this is the screenshot out of MIM. So that's a good question. So here we're seeing on the left the role, the corp admin's role, and you can see that it has a PAM privilege associated with it. This is the corp.corp admins group, which is pictured on the right. And that's just a regular group as far as MIM is concerned. It's just a regular security group that has been copied over effectively from the corporate environment. And down at the bottom is a small screenshot out of Active Directory users and computers showing a user and a single group that have been migrated. These things get created for us by PowerShells unless we do it by hand, which we can also do. Okay, so when we migrate, the assumption typically is that the group memberships that we find in the corporate environment are correct. In other words, the administrators that we have today are the ones we want to have tomorrow. That doesn't have to be true, of course. It could well be that we've collected a few permissions over time that we shouldn't have anymore. So one of the first tasks is to do an attestation round on the groups concerned and make sure that the current members in the corporate environment are, of course, the ones you want. Then we can simply use PowerShell to say, take those groups and establish them in the privileged environment and make the current members into privileged users. So we end up with this sort of picture. As you can see, there's a full summary of the PowerShells coming up next. But you can see here we've got a new PAM group PowerShell commandlet which creates the group and copies its SID into SID history. So that's kind of the green arrows, if you like, into the priv security group. Then we've got a new PAM user. So this creates a user object in MIM and also a user account in AD in the privileged side. A new PAM role then puts the persons in as candidates and the groups in as privileges. Okay, so that's the structure that we end up with after we've migrated a user. And once we're happy that that's all working, we remove the user from the security group in the corporate environment so that we've cleaned up and that we're not using the old permissioning structures but the new ones. Okay, so that's that. There's a quick list of PowerShell commandlets. I'm not going to go into detail. There's a little bit of a slide. These slides will be available after the event. You can see that there's a MIM PAM module that gets imported down at the bottom there. And you can see some sort of sample text. I don't recommend using pass@word1 as your privileged password necessarily, but it's just an example. So these are the sorts of steps we're going to take. So a quick talk about processes. I won't go into detail because I simply haven't got time. This is a big part of any conversation. We have a number of life cycles beyond what we would call our regular user and group life cycles, where we're considering which users do we need in the PAM environment and which groups are being managed in the PAM environment. This is all fairly, if you like, obvious stuff we have to decide. We also have to worry about how to get somebody to be a candidate and who needs to approve that. The easiest and the simplest process is to say this is all done by hand in the privileged environment, and trusted people are the only people who can be allowed to do that. That's fine as long as you've got a few dozen accounts in a few dozen roles, but if you've got hundreds or in some environments even 1,000 or more privileged accounts, you're going to need to work out how to automate this process, and that's a bit more exciting because you typically end up forcing yourself to read data out of the compromised corporate environment, and you need to be extremely careful about how you do that and how you check that you're not reading compromised data. So there are approvals. I know you're going to do approvals wrapped around elevations, for example. So these are all considerations you'll have to pay some attention to. So when you come to do this deployment, should you come to do this deployment, I'll ask you a question actually after this slide. Should you come to do this deployment, so many of you might be aware that MIM 2016, there is a Community Technical Preview, a CTP, which is kind of a beta version of the service pack that will be coming up soon. It's a public preview at the moment. It contains a deployment pack for PAM, which contains scripts to help you deploy domain controllers, apply policies, lock them down, remove unnecessary components, that sort of thing. For domain controllers, SQL Server Cluster, and the MIM servers themselves. This is obviously aimed at making the deployment process more painless than it sometimes can be. We have a training course coming up on August 9th. Yeah, if you search Microsoft.com for June CTP MIM 2016, you'll find a blog entry about it, and you can get it from the Connect site. I believe it's public. Certainly the information is public. I believe you can pretty much download it freely. So we've got a training course coming up. In fact, we've got two. I didn't mention the second one. We've got one coming up in the UK on August the 9th, and one I think on the 12th of September in Redmond, near Seattle. We've got some training coming up, and for your ongoing support, we have some experience, so we'd like to help you. It's the point of the exercise to some extent. So there we go. I will ask you a question in a moment, but let's just quickly look at the business of cloud identity management, privileged identity management. I mentioned this very quickly because we're running out of time, and it's not really our core subject, but there is a feature that you can currently download in preview or attach in preview out of the marketplace called Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. For those of you using Office 365 or any other service wrapped around Azure Active Directory in the Microsoft Cloud, the privileged identity management in the cloud has a similar sort of approach to the PAM on-premises, namely that you want just-in-time admins. So here, first of all, there's an analysis saying you've got too many administrators who are permanent, and you might want to make some of them temporary. So this is the same idea. You're making permanent administrators into temporary ones, where they have to ask for activation. That's the language they use in this environment. And in this case, you can, of course, use MFA, because we are in the cloud anyway. Yes, first of all, you get an analysis, and then there's a workflow where you can go ahead and ask for an activation. Here's the activate button you can see on the right there, and you can put a reason in and activate it, and then you can be the global administrator for the period of time. And lots of people get notified when you do that, so that everyone's paying a little bit of attention to who's doing what in your tenant. And this is all good stuff. This is all just-in-time admin, and we're going to see increasing amounts of this sort of thing in the Microsoft Cloud. Basic attestation features exist as well, so you're invited to do a review periodically of the administrative access. So this is the workflow in the new portal where you can review the access, and you can either approve or deny the access according to how you're feeling on the day and who really needs that particular role at the time. So you can either get the security administrator to do it, or users can do self-attestation, which is easier but perhaps not such high assurance. Depends on your needs in that case. So that brings us pretty much to the end of our slides and the end of our time. I have attempted to show you then that Microsoft is providing the features that you need to manage privileged accounts in this slightly narrow sense of preventing their token theft and token reuse, both for on-premises and for hybrid. And there are a number of other challenges that we need to address in any project around service accounts, which will have to run typically in our corporate environment, and therefore we use various lockdown approaches, minimum permissions, that sort of thing. And then systems that don't use AD and the sort of Kerberos type integrations that we're talking about, how can we try and lock down their admins? It's a whole separate set of discussions. Planning and secure operations can be quite interesting. The fundamental thing is that prevention is better than cure, so getting started is a good thing. So this presentation will be available for download. My colleague Jackie will make this available, and the recording. And we've got a couple of questions. So let's try and deal with the questions. For those of you who have to drop off for time reasons, I appreciate your attending. Thank you very much. So should you have no further time, I will sign off and continue to answer questions. But if you need to leave, then thank you for your attendance. I'll continue to answer some questions if I can. So, does this feature also extend to AD groups using SQL roles? Can't answer that immediately. If you have AD integrated SQL, I believe that it will work. As far as enterprise PAM solutions such as CyberArk, so this is really what I was alluding to at the beginning when I said that we need to be clear on what exactly we're trying to solve. PAM is an expression obviously used by people like CyberArk, and they tend to go into sort of broader privileged access stuff like session recording, password rotation, all sorts of interesting things around handling privileged access. Microsoft have limited themselves in this case to protecting the Microsoft estate and the theft of Microsoft credentials from the Microsoft estate. So it's not as broad a solution as the sort of CyberArks and these sorts of things. Thanks, Norbert. How do we answer that? Can you integrate PAM with Azure PIM? Well, you can, but it's kind of lumpy at the moment. We're talking about synchronizing key data up from on-premise into the cloud. Again, do you really want to connect your on-premise PAM environment to the cloud? Good question. I might be nervous about that. I talk to Microsoft occasionally about integrating particularly the learnings from the cloud. If we detect that our cloud presence is under attack, we're going to want to know that on-premise. And we're talking about how the triggers that are detected by identity protection in the cloud get transmitted back to on-premise. So that's an interesting discussion. I think it's fair to say we haven't got very far with that integration yet in terms of formal integrations. They're currently reasonably standalone systems. So Dave, logging in with a priv account on a server that's joined to the corporate domain. So first of all, you don't want to log into that server with your priv account. Okay, you want to be using remote tools as best you can. Clearly, if you can't, so you need to install your management tools in the priv environment on a management workstation in the priv environment, because you don't want to be logging into the corporate environment strictly with a priv account. And we'll prevent that login using policies. So this is fundamentally going to work well for things that will use SID history, or perhaps the direct granting of permissions to priv groups, but it has to work using Active Directory groups for this system really to be useful. So it is basically handled by the trust. You won't put your servers in the priv domain fundamentally, unless you're managing priv itself, of course, in which case you are in the priv domain. So the function level of AD, well, 20 Bastion Forest, I'm not sure you need a very high. The fundamental requirement is, I'm going to say 2012 R2, but I suspect it would work with earlier versions. The interesting point there that I didn't have time for in the main thing is that in Windows 2012 R2, you have very limited options for limiting the lifetime of Kerberos tokens. You can do it increasingly using authentication policies, or there are global policies that affect the entire domain for the lifetime of tickets. In 2016 server, we're going to have the capability to issue a Kerberos token with a specified lifetime for a specific task. So when we request an elevated permission, the integration between PAM and the Windows 2016 server domain will issue me with a Kerberos token that has the specific lifetime of the elevation that I just requested. So to get the most out of this, you're going to need 2016. That's the short answer. If you have 2012, it'll still work. Massive amount of data. So what features does MIM rest upon? So the data that is generated, typically what you're interested in logging, of course, is the escalation activity and the expiry of those escalations. Those objects are available in the MIM database for as long as the lifetime you set. There are lifetime settings in MIM to say how long you want to keep this data. But if you want to keep it for longer than MIM really can because of scalability or performance issues, you'll need to extract that data to a longer term storage, whether it's by implementing MIM's own reporting solution or whether you simply extract the data as you say, to a BI or some sort of a thing. You are interested in monitoring both event logs and the MIM database, which is where the escalation items are. Those are the things you're paying attention to. So you're right. I mean, the massive amount of data, it clearly is going to depend on how many admins you've got and how much activity they generate. So if you've got 20 admins each doing, I don't know, 5 or 6 escalations a day, that wouldn't really be categorized as a massive amount of data. But you clearly, in a large environment, might very well have a lot of data. So yes, I think reporting is going to be a significant piece of this. The Microsoft solution doesn't really go beyond storing the data in the MIM database and making it available to MIM's own reporting solution. You will almost certainly want to integrate it into some form of monitoring SIAM solution, long-term data storage for even for forensics after the event should something happen. So yes, I think Donnie, you're right about needing further solutions around long-term data storage and reporting capability and monitoring capability. Predefined connectors for Microsoft PAM to various endpoints. The purpose of PAM really isn't to talk to various endpoints in the sort of classic identity management sense. The point would be to use Active Directory using its SID capabilities to allow you to do administration to Active Directory integrated endpoints. MIM itself does have various abilities to talk to various endpoints, but it's reasonably unlikely you'll want to do that out of your PAM environment, although there are some interesting situations where you might want to. So yes, there are generic LDAP solutions and ODBC connectors, AD, SQL, SAP, all sorts of interesting solutions that you could in principle implement on the back of this if you were doing some heterogeneous work where it's not all AD, where you might want to synchronize permissions based on escalations into target systems that aren't AD integrated, so you could do that. So MIM is installed in the Baton AD NOSH in this environment, although it's not unusual for people to have both a corporate FIM or MIM doing their regular identity management and also an implementation, a separate implementation in the privileged environment, which is really just there for MIM purposes. How would I compare the hash to be what PIM provides us unexpiring accounts for X minutes, hours, which also limits token age? Yeah, the basic difference is that the token age in that environment, X is fixed, right? So in our environment, when you make a request for an escalation, the user themselves makes an estimation of how long they need the token for, and that's how long it will be valid for. I think as long as you're limiting token age to a number of minutes, a countable number of minutes, rather than many, many days and hours, then you're probably doing something right. So as long as you are limiting token age, then you're going to be good to go. So there are some policies that you can use. The good thing about PAM with 2016 is going to be that we can make very specific requests to get a token that is exactly the right length for the session that has been asked for. So migration from an existing PAM solution to Microsoft PAM, well, first of all, you'd have to have one-to-one functionality overlap, which is perhaps optimistic, given what we just said about the differences between the sort of philosophies around PAM and what other vendors are offering in terms of session recording, password rotation, that sort of thing. I think that's going to be pretty unfeasible. I think you'll be able to use policies and you'll be able to use your security considerations in the new solution. But in terms of the implementation, I suspect you're going to be building from scratch. Thank you, Donnie. Has you built any added value? Well, funnily enough, we have built some added value. Again, it won't be applicable to every level of assurance that all organizations need. So if you're in a very high assurance environment, our add-ins aren't going to be that useful. But what we've done, we've got an HTML5 portal to go with MIM or FIM in your corporate environment. That's just sort of regular user and role management, including RBAC in the regular corporate environment. In there is functionality to request candidate access for PAM. So in our existing portal extensions for MIM and FIM, there are these PAM candidate requests already built in. So that we've already addressed the issue of candidate lifecycle management with the caveat that we do this in the untrusted corporate environment. So if you've got a highly trusted environment, you wouldn't want to use that, a high assurance environment, not highly trusted, a high assurance environment where you must be very, very secure. You probably don't want to be doing your candidate approvals in your corporate environment where we're not certain of people's identity. So we've developed it and put it in, and it's available if you need it. So yes, we've added some value there. But yeah, that's pretty much what we've come up with so far. Can you configure a policy for self-approval? Yeah, that's the default policy actually. In terms of the elevations, elevations are auto-approved by default. So if you're a candidate for something and you can log into the privileged environment, you can escalate yourself without approval to your escalated permissions and get on with your job. The option to add approvals into that is a straightforward FIM or MIM approval type of a thing that we know and love. And yeah, that's just a workflow configuration that you can set up. So an administrator, anybody can elevate themselves for a short period. Again, depending on your assurance needs and the high availability of your security staff. Is there somebody to do approvals at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning? If there is, then we might consider approvals. And if there is, then we're probably taking it all a bit seriously, and we can do those approvals. Michael, MIM 2016 is not required in Corp to use it in Priv. So they're two separate implementations. Okay, well that draws us to the close, I think, of the various questions. I did, because you're still here, what are you still doing here? I was going to ask you after relation, where do we log into? You log into you are already logged into your privileged management workstation where your various tools that you need are installed. So then you go ahead and use those tools on the privileged management workstation to do remote access back into the corporate environment. Do you confirm that MIM service plus sync plus PAM must be deployed in the Bastion Forest? Well, service, yes. The PAM components, yes. Sync is not specifically required. The whole thing runs on a MIM database, and the PAM components really consist of the REST API and the PowerShells that allow you to trigger it. You'll definitely need those, but MIMSync isn't specifically required. As I say, we typically use MIMSync because of the need to do lifecycle management, around various things. So synchronizing data sometimes out of the corporate environment, but depending on your assurance requirements, you may decide that that's not sufficiently secure, so you might not want to do that. So just because we're here, can we go ahead? I'm just going to ask you some questions. I'll give you only a few seconds to do this. There are only 37 of you remaining. I'm just going to ask you if you've been attacked. This is just useful for our background. You don't have to answer this. And of course, there are various, not as far as I know, and I'm not telling you, and various things like that could be answers. But let's give you another 10 seconds. And I will reveal to you the answers but not the respondents, just for your information. So about half of you have voted, and it's 20% yes, 80% no. So that's pretty much in line with the sort of level of disclosure that we were getting from previous conversations we've had. I'm going to close this poll because I'm going to ask you another one. So I would be interested in which of you, if you are using Azure Active Directory with Office 365, whether you've come across this privileged identity management piece, and whether you're heading towards Azure Active Directory. This is of interest, obviously, to the environment, particularly those of you who might have found privileged identity for the cloud already. For those 44% of you who are using it but without privileged identity, you can use it for free for the time being. Once it all launches and goes into general availability, there will be a license required, so it's a premium feature. It's an AAD Premium S2 feature for those of you who care about these things. So there are some licenses required if you did want to use it, but it's certainly worth looking into for those of you who are using it. So just for the record, I'm getting about 3/4 of you are either using it or are planning to, and about 1/4 of you aren't using it at all. As far as I know, there won't be an Office 365 licenses. All of that changes all the time. Microsoft bolt bits and pieces into various levels of O365, but as far as I know, it's not in an O365 license currently. Okay, and the last thing, just because it's all highly entertaining. So this is actually straightforward sales attempt. We've got some training coming up, and I'm just interested in the general level of interest. Of course, I haven't given you the option to say yes, I'd like a full week's training on this, but basically we're thinking we can get through the important stuff in a day. You are then running a MIM environment in your privileged access environment, and you may find you need some general training around MIM to get the most out of it and configure workflows and do the management and stuff. But for that, what you might call regular privileged access work is all good. So thank you for doing that. We've got some interest. About half of you are interested, and some of you are maybe or not. Thank you for contributing. All right, well, that is our hour, and I'm going to close this poll. I'm going to thank you again for attending. Watch this space for the availability of the slides. Jackie, I don't know quite how Jackie's going to make that available to you. I dare say there'll be a link up on our OCG Learning website.